in my chapter, I'm dealing with Ukraine's relations with the EU. And it is really about the implementation of the association agreement. Association agreement is not only one of the most complex and longest agreements in the world, but also it has the most contested. In the end, it's the only free trade agreement which triggered a military backlash from a neighboring state, i.e. Russia. So that stakes, insofar as Ukraine's integration with the EU is concerned, are very, very high. The association agreement is supposed to address the problems facing Ukraine, like weak state institutions, a weak rule of law, and a weak economy. And yet, those problems are precisely those which actually hamper the implementation of the association agreement. Instead, what we have in Ukraine, which is a very interesting phenomenon, rather bottom-up reform coalitions, informal networks of Ukrainian officials, of Ukrainian politicians, civil society, even journalists, as well as international experts and officials. In every policy field, in every sector, they are trying to push reforms, trigger reforms, to push them through, and the EU, somewhat belatedly, has responded to the needs of those reform coalitions to actually function effectively, and has, for example, agreed to create 2,000 specially dedicated posts for civil servants to act as a reform avant-garde. In general, the EU, in recognition of the challenges facing Ukraine, has offered what doesn't happen very often, a dynamic and sort of unprecedented dynamic and agile support, including quite a few innovations. One of those innovations are those 2,000 avant-garde reform posts. Another is offering Ukraine macroeconomic assistance in recognition of Ukraine's massive economic crisis immediately after the Euromaidan protests. Also, the EU has made a special arrangement, a dedicated body funded by the European Commission, which is called the Support Group for Ukraine. Because of Ukraine's dual realities, formal and informal institutions interacting, it's very important that international donors in general, and the EU in particular, have developed this deep knowledge of how Ukraine functions. Because what we've seen so far, international donors and the EU go to the top, to the president and the prime minister, assuming that if they go to the top, things trickle down and reforms are driven from the top. Whereas actually in Ukraine, the reformers are concentrated at the middle level, and they need to be supported, top officials in Ukraine, who unfortunately cannot be perceived as people who promote reforms in Ukraine. So this sort of deep knowledge and exerting political pressure seems to be an indispensable component of effective international support for the reforms. And I'm actually pleased to say that since the sort of main body of research for the report took place, by the time the report came out, perhaps due to the report, we've seen an unprecedented mobilization, the EU openly criticizing the Ukrainian leaders for not implementing the reforms. So it's very important to see that actually EU is prepared to step outside its comfort zone and actually call things by their names and criticize the Ukrainian elites for not living up to the aspirations which were so vividly expressed during the protests. Ukraine is a battlefield for reforms. Every single reform measure is contested, and there are no quick fixes to Ukraine. And what we've seen, for example, from many EU member states, from the EU institutions, this kind of impatience and the sense of Ukraine fatigue. And this is sort of one of the typical sins of international donors, this institutional impatience. And we already seen, even insofar as the EU is concerned, that lessons have been learned, but much more engagement, much more sort of strategic support, and not just technical assistance is needed for Ukraine to succeed.